China is the country that farms the most oysters in the world. Imagine that right now. Somewhere along the shores of China, more than 80% of all the oysters that end up on people's plates are being cultivated. Sounds like a gold mine. Locals are eating, plus oysters can be sold abroad, bringing in cash, but the residents of coastal cities might disagree as they're noticing more and more piles like this. Yep, all of that is oyster shells. First off, they don't exactly look great, and second, they're basically pollution machines, since over time various bacteria start multiplying on the shells, plus they can cause diseases and who knows what else. But the Chinese have found a use for these piles of junk, tossing oyster shells into barren, dying, or desert soil. Why? Let's figure out what the Chinese have come up with this time. The relationship between China and oysters goes way back to ancient times. Even back then, these sea creatures were seen as a good food source, and in certain places, the Chinese even used oysters for tasks that were pretty innovative for those days. Yes, this is a bridge. What do oysters have to do with it? In 1058, scholar Kai Xiang came up with a new concept for building such structures, growing oyster reefs around the foundation supports to structurally reinforce them and provide solid protection against powerful weather waves. For a long time, large-scale oyster farming in China was out of the question. But in the 1980s, the oyster industry started to take off. The presence of a coastline stretching 11,000 miles and conditions perfect for oyster farming, all of this had to be put to use to meet various needs. In 1983, the total area of oyster farms was estimated at 62,000 acres, and by 1986 it reached 91,000 acres. Then, as of 2020, the area devoted to oyster farming had grown to a staggering 408,000 acres. In other words, if you saw one farm back in the 80s, less than 40 years later, it turned into 4 places for raising shellfish. In 2006, the Chinese did the math and figured out their production volume was 3.89 million tons per year. With that number, they were already producing 81.5% of the world's total oyster production. And that was even before oyster farms were at their peak. By 2020, when oyster farms covered a whopping 408,000 acres, production had reached 5.4 million tons. No other country can keep up with the spread of oyster farming in China, so as we head into this decade, the country's still cranking out over 80% of the world's oysters. Key areas of China's oyster industry are the provinces of Fujian, Guangdong, Shandong, and Guangxi. These places have the best conditions for oyster farming, which is why the number of farms and production is constantly growing. Of the 5.4 million tons produced in total, 4.6 million tons come from these provinces. Overall, it's hard to overstate the importance of these regions for China's oyster sector, but at the same time, the high production levels have become somewhat of a challenge. Oysters are creatures from which humans only need the meat in the middle, which makes up about 10% of the total mass. The rest is the shell, which in China is often just thrown away wherever. Here's an example from Dongshan County, Fujian Province. A huge pile of shells was just dumped somewhere. Of course, you could say that oysters are, after all, a natural organism that can't really harm it. However, oyster shells don't decompose biologically. Bacteria breed there, and that's why piles of shells can become harmful to humans. On top of that, some studies show that oyster shells lying around everywhere are a source of toxic gases like hydrogen sulfide and ammonia. All of this is very harmful. If we look at the situation with oyster waste in general, in China, especially in the provinces mentioned earlier, it's already become one of the main sources of coastal zone pollution. On top of that, it's growing in scale because, as we've seen, oyster farming areas and production in China are constantly expanding, which means the waste increases every year. In 2024, China generates about 3 million tons of oyster waste in the form of shells, and most of it ends up in piles that pollute the environment. At the same time, Chinese scientists in Fujian province began to observe soil that was slowly withering, losing its fertility. The cause was the high level of soil acidity, which was brought about by various improper and totally unsparing farming practices, along with heavy rainfall. Scientists concluded that oyster shells might actually be a solution in this situation. Well, of course, burying an oyster shell in the soil is, let's say, not the most effective activity. The result would probably be soil with a shell inside. In this case, Chinese soil scientists and other experts were working with the armor of sea creatures. It was calcined at a temperature of 1472 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes and then turned into a soil conditioner. that is, into a powder like this. The researchers also chose a location in the Fujian province stretching over 5 acres. Such a small area was enough to test the hypothesis. It should be noted that the experimental area had a certain number of longan trees, which, due to the high soil acidity, gradually began to die. The fruits were prone to cracking, and the overall condition of the trees worsened. In other words, the plants were heading toward death due to the dying surface beneath them. Crushed oyster shells were added to the soil in March 2022, and the experiment ended in August of the same year. After collecting and analyzing samples, it was found that the soil acidity had decreased and the pH level had risen. How did this happen? The main component of oyster shells is calcium, which is exactly what raises the pH. This increase in pH is really beneficial for plants growing in acidic soils because soils with higher pH contain more useful bacteria that turn nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium into forms that plants can easily absorb. There's a small amount of magnesium, sodium, copper, iron, and nickel in the shells, so everything that grew in the area fertilized with oysters was clearly thankful for the Chinese researchers' experiment. It was recorded that the beneficial substances for plants in the soil increased by 49 to 57%. All this led to the weight of the longan fruit increasing by 6.37%, and concerns about cracking and low quality became a thing of the past. Yes, powdered oyster shells do a great job of turning drying soil into something fertile. By the way, they also found chives growing on the studied plot, which faced trouble due to the dying soil. Their yield was really struggling until the oyster powder experiment started. It turned out that chives really liked oyster shells much more than longan. Their yield shot up by a full 57.8%, plus a bunch of morphological indexes got a huge boost. The same researchers also did another experiment, adding pomelo, tomatoes, and lychees to the struggling soil. A year later, they found that the pH of the soil with pomelos had increased by 1.1 units, and organic matter had gone up by 27.7%. Soil samples with tomatoes showed that the exchangeable calcium content had increased by 10.45%. The soil with lychees, due to oysters, gained 1.36 units in pH compared to the soil without any additives. Besides, it was found that in other control groups, with the addition of oyster conditioner, the content of organic matter, nitrogen, and exchangeable calcium increased by 48%, 69%, and 32% respectively. All this sounds like the Chinese just need to set up large-scale production of oyster powder to make a lot of crops grow even on dying soils. But there's one question left. What about other plants apart from the ones we've already looked at? Well, the Chinese claim that oyster shells are a universal cheat for turning low-quality soil into something suitable for farming. Take peanuts, for example. And if you immediately thought that peanuts and China are a strange combination, we're here to surprise you. China is the largest producer of peanuts in the world. For instance, in 2013, the country produced just over 17 million tons of peanuts, which made up 37.3% of the global harvest. At that time, such a high figure was thanks to 11 million acres of planted fields. Next in line after China was India, which grew its peanuts on an even bigger territory. The peanut fields in India spanned 13 million acres. This is where another impressive fact about China stands out. Despite having a smaller field area, they produce more peanuts. And to put it in numbers, China's yield is an incredible 8,000 pounds per 2.5 acres. Meanwhile, in India, the yield was just 4,000 pounds per 2.5 acres. Despite this, Chinese peanuts, like other crops, had already started to suffer from the poor soil quality back then. And of course, the extreme pollution in China and desertification played their part. Studies were conducted showing oyster powder can also help save peanuts. However, the result did not please. With an incredible increase in soil fertility or yield, the oyster shells didn't make it possible to grow peanuts in the desert with an unusually high number of crops. Scientists took a certain area where from 2013 to 2018, peanuts had low yields. What's more, the yield kept decreasing every year. That's why they decided to add an oyster conditioner. After that, the researchers checked the results of their work and found that the soil's pH had risen and the overall condition improved. However, on all the selected plots, the peanut yield continued to decrease. Anyway, if you add oyster shell fertilizer to the soil, it won't hurt. In fact, there are entire companies that focus on dealing with the pollution from oyster shells while also improving the condition of dying soils. In 2018, a project for processing oyster shells from Huiyan County was launched at the Light Industry Park in Wangchun City, covering a total area of 34 acres. It can process 120,000 tons of solid oyster shell waste every year. This is great because, as you probably remember, there are a huge number of oyster piles in China. Reducing them by 120,000 tons a year is a significant contribution. But that's not all, because right here, they can also turn them into 100,000 tons of soil conditioners. In this same county, oyster powder was tested on lettuce. The companies Mata and Guangzhou Xinhe Agricultural Development, with support from the Huiyan government, added nearly 271 tons of soil conditioner to 1,800 acres of soil that wasn't very fertile. As a result, the soil's pH level rose from 5.11 to 6.05, significantly improving the soil cover. At the same time, the organic matter content increased by 37.6% compared to the levels before application. And most importantly, the use of the soil conditioner led to a very nice 20% increase in lettuce yield. The director of the Urban Carbon Neutrality Research Center at the Chinese Academy of Sciences also commented on this project. His words highlight yet another benefit of using oyster-based conditioners for soils with poor fertility. Essentially, by boosting organic matter in the soil, carbon dioxide emissions are reduced. To solidify oyster powder's role as a hero for Chinese soils and the environment, it was noted that one cycle of lettuce farming with oysters can cut carbon dioxide emissions by 5,643 tons. And also, it should be added that using a soil conditioner followed by improving soil quality is a way to save people from various food-related problems, as well as a chance for farmers to earn more. No, we didn't come up with this to emphasize the importance of oysters. Just take a look here. When it comes to soil conditioner, the improvement of soil quality is achieved without using chemicals, meaning less need for all sorts of chemical fertilizers. As a result, people will consume fewer of them from the vegetables, fruits, and everything else that's grown. Besides, less chemicals means fewer costs, while the quality of agricultural products improves. Higher quality fruits and vegetables are more expensive. Do you see the benefit? In short, the solution is perfect. So now we just have to wait for the oyster soil conditioner to spread across all corners of China. That way, we'll seriously reduce the amount of oyster shells, turn dying lands into something more suitable for high yields, and make money. Maybe the oyster soil conditioner will even one day reach the deserts that the Chinese are actively greening. Oyster shells definitely have the potential. In general, you get the idea. In China, there's a strong focus on learning how to use an oyster soil conditioner, which helps improve the waste situation and soil fertility. However, China's work with oysters doesn't stop there, as wild oysters are in a very fragile state due to human impact. One of the rescue projects is in the Pak Nai area of Hong Kong, where the Nature Conservancy and the University of Hong Kong have been working since 2020 to restore an abandoned oyster farm and study the biodiversity of the area. It should be said up front that the project is extremely complicated. Nearby, you have both Hong Kong and Shenzhen, two cities that are hardly quiet or considerate of the nature around them. These two massive settlements have been working for a long time to rapidly consume all the resources in their vicinity. Nonetheless, enterprising people managed to do something incredible. They created oyster reefs here in the old muddy shallows near Pak Nai, a historic village along the deep bay in the northern region of the New Territories in Hong Kong. Once oysters were harvested here, they used posts that were driven into the muddy bottom. Yes, this is how sea creatures were grown here. Hundreds, maybe even thousands of perfectly standing sticks which oysters used as their home. Later, this method was replaced with a more modern one, growing oysters on rafts floating in the water. But now ecologists decided to use the old trusty post to restore oyster populations where they had disappeared, just with one change. The posts were set in random piles, looking like natural oyster reefs. Naturally, the posts were shifting toward the sea, where the tidal zone is wetter and oysters flourish, helping restore coastal and tidal habitats to a more natural state. While most oyster reef restoration projects need to plant young oysters raised in nurseries, the waters around Hong Kong are so full of larvae that oysters grow on their own, and all they need is a substrate to attach to. That's where the posts, which were once used for oyster farming, come into play. Actually, the larvae of marine creatures have completely covered the substrate provided by humans. Meanwhile, biodiversity research discovered 61 species on abandoned farms compared to 26 species on nearby muddy shoals, as well as 10 times more biomass. The project participants aren't saying that the solution is incredibly effective just yet. However, they add that at least they managed to increase the number of horseshoe crabs, creatures that have been roaming the waters and shores of our planet for millions of years. Also, in 2020, a small crab with a complex Latin name, Nenacesarma pontianensis, was discovered for the first time. By the way, it was first documented in Hong Kong. Restoring natural oyster populations here is an incredibly important task. Oyster reefs are complex 3D structures that make up an important marine ecosystem, and their restoration can help mitigate the damage caused by urbanization and protect the marine treasures of the area. Oysters are also an incredibly efficient water filter. One species called Magellana hongkongensis, which is one of the highest filtration rates among all oyster species, can filter up to 8 gallons of water per hour during the summer. So as scientists say, a reef that spans 75 square feet can filter an entire Olympic-sized pool every day. Does this mean that oysters are the saviors of both China's coastal waters and barren lands? They're a universal creature, hard to replace in nature. Apparently, China understands this well. And while oyster projects may not be widespread now, they'll definitely gain it in the near future.